The girl died during the surgery, and several speculations have arisen that either Finney was a sadistic doctor who killed the little girl, or that the demons within the home botched his attempts at saving her life. Either way, this fateful night created the legend of the Sally House. The legend also says that the girl, dubbed Sally, believed she died at the hands of torture and would seek revenge on men who entered the house. Paranormal investigators have discovered both demonic entities along with spirits of the deceased within this home. Now, the hauntings of the Sally House first became public by the accounts of Tony and Deborah Pickman, who bought the house to raise a family. A few of these encountered included dolls within the nursery being taken from the shelves and placed within a circle. And actually, that's happened here at the jail. Then people began asking why they left the light on within the nursery at night, when in reality, because of the events that had taken place, they had moved their son into their own room and they would turn all the lights out. Now, when Tony and Deborah attempted a sage cleansing of their home, Tony was scratched and then thrown across the room. And when Deborah attempted to help him get up, she couldn't help him because he was held down by such an invisible force, and she couldn't help him get up. Other reports have also been made, such as visions of an apparition of a frightened little girl within the kitchen, along with sightings of a young woman. The woman has been reported to be Joanna Barnes, Finney's relative who had lived next door and reportedly battled with her mental health. So that's interesting too. Yes. And other sightings include witnessing black figures throughout the house, along with seeing two ghostly girls named Emily and Anna Briggs. They have been reported to throw things at people when visiting the home. The house now sits unoccupied, and the owners do not advise people going into the house because of the demons that they think is there.
I don't blame them. I wouldn't want to be a part of that myself.
Absolutely.
So the next crime scene we're going to talk about is Murder at Helsen. In Spring Green, Wisconsin, sits a breathtaking home that was one of the most brilliant minds of architectural design, Frank Lloyd Wright, built. Now, this home was specifically built for him and his mistress in 1911 in a secluded area to keep out of the public's view.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Frank, he was married with 6 children of his own, and Martha, who was also married with 2 children herself, were looked down upon for their actions.
Oh, boy.
Well, this home offered them refuge from the scrutiny that they were receiving.
Mm-hmm.
But one afternoon on August 15th, 1914, death and tragedy struck this beautiful home. Wright was not present at the time, being away in Chicago working on a building design. A disgruntled worker who had been recently told he was being released from his duties barged into the home, and while Martha, her 2 children, and several workers sat down to eat lunch, brutally attacked Martha and her 2 children with a hatchet, then ran out, setting the house on fire and locking the door behind him so no one could escape. Now, however, a few workers did manage to escape and ran to the nearest house. Now, once back to the Wright home, the bodies inside were taken out and placed in a cottage on that property, where a total of 6 people were confirmed dead, and 1 that died later from his wounds. These deaths included Martha and her 2 children, 3 workers, and a 13-year-old boy.
Oh, wow.
Now, later on, the disgruntled worker that caused all this tragedy was found in the basement of the home barely conscious, having swallowed muriatic acid. He died 7 days later from starvation due to the burns caused by the acid on his esophagus.
And that would be painful.
That would be horrible. It is the cottage that the bodies were taken to where the spirits of those who tragically lost their lives that day still reside. Now, Martha's spirit has been seen several times wearing a long white gown. They say even though she is a peaceful presence, she appears to be lost and restless. Now, others have witnessed doors and windows opening and closing and lights turning on and off. Phantom smells of smoke and gas have been reported, along with hearing the voices of children echo throughout the cottage.
Oh, yeah, and that's also something, too, when you always see kids in tragedy.
It's not a very nice sight.
Mm-hmm. Which brings us to one of my favorite haunted crime scenes and stories, and that is the Lizzie Borden house, located in Fall River, Massachusetts. It's now the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast Museum, but it was once the site of a gruesome murder. The tragic events that took place on August 4th, 1892, involved Andrew and Abby Borden, Lizzie's father and stepmother. Now, Lizzie herself and the maid, Bridget Sullivan, who she called Maggie out of disrespect, they were all there that day. And it is important to take note that the entire family, including Bridget, had all been ill over the last several days leading up to the murder. Suspected stomach flu or possible food poisoning were the family's guess. Now, none of them were quite feeling up to par. Their Uncle Andrew's previous wife's brother, I know that's a mouthful, his name was John. He showed up unannounced that day, but, that wasn't uncommon from him. He's done it before because he was a traveling salesman, and he would stop in for visits as he passed through. Now, it was a little after 9 a.m. on August 4th when Abby went to the guest room upstairs to place fresh linens on the bed, and Bridget set about doing her daily chores, which including retrieving the pails and water from the barn. There was a barn out back. A little before 10, Andrew came home, and Bridget overheard Lizzie telling him that Mrs. Borden, as she preferred to call her, had gone out, that she had received a note from someone who was sick. Now, Andrew ended up laying down on his favorite sofa in the sitting room as Lizzie began to heat up an iron to press some handkerchiefs. Bridget, not feeling well, decided to head up to the room for a nap just before 11. Now, very shortly later, Bridget was awoke by Lizzie's urgent cries for her to come downstairs. She found her by the back door, pale-faced and taut. She asked Lizzie what was wrong, and Lizzie just cried that her father's dead. Somebody's come in and killed him. Lizzie wouldn't let Bridget into the sitting room. Instead, she directed her to run and get the doctor. Now, Dr. Bowen, he lived just across the street from them, but when Bridget got to his house, she found he was out, so she relayed to Mrs. Bowen that Mr. Borden had been killed and ran back to the house. When Bridget got back there, she asked Lizzie where she was when all this occurred, and her response was, "I was out in the yard, and I heard a groan and came in. The screen door was wide open." Lizzie then sent Bridget to summon the Borden sister's friend, who lived a few blocks away. Now, it was at this point that the neighbors began to notice something was wrong. Mrs. Churchill showed up and ended up asking Lizzie where she was when all this happened, and her response to her was, "I went out to the barn to get a piece of iron." Lizzie also added that she thought her stepmother had been killed as well, and that her father must have had an enemy because they'd all been recently sick, right? Abby was later found dead upstairs with 19 blows to her head, and it was found that she had been killed previous to Andrew. Both had been killed by a hatchet. Tests were done, and no poisons or toxins were found in the Borden's bodies as Lizzie had previously claimed. There was much controversies, debates, and theories as to the death of Mr. and Mrs. Borden, but no one was ever convicted for these murders. Now, of course, Lizzie was tried and acquitted for the murders. She was accused. With all of these, mysterious and tragic events that happened in the Borden family, it is no wonder why there are restless spirits there, and they still reside there to this day. Sounds of a woman weeping can be heard, along with seeing a woman in Victoria area clothing, dusting furniture and straightening the covers on beds. Occasionally, she has been seen straightening the beds while the guests were still laying in the beds. Now, that would be freaky.
That'd be a little nervy.
Yes. Footsteps can also be heard going up and down the stairs and crossing back and forth on the floor above. Doors open and close often, and muffled conversations can be heard coming from inside vacant rooms. The smell of a faint floral scent can also be detected from time to time, along with the occasional sighting of shadows lurking about. Now, I have never been there, but I would love to go.
That has been one of the stories that's intrigued me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so next up we have the Sultan's Palace. As the legend goes for this tale, Joseph Garnett arrived in New Orleans with dreams of becoming a successful dentist, and so it appears that his dreams were meant to come true. In 1936, he had an architect design him a stately home. This home ended up being a 3.5-story mansion that included a raised half-basement. However, just a few years later, he sold the home to Jean Laprete, a wealthy bank merchant and plantation owner. Unfortunate events arose when the Civil War erupted in the 1860s, and Laprete's financial stability had crumbled. He could no longer maintain the upkeep of the house and decided to lease the mansion to the French Quarter. Not long after, he was approached by a man of Middle Eastern descent. Now, this man explained that his brother was the Sultan and was interested in renting the property.
Very interesting.
Now, Laprete, relieved that he was getting relief from his financial worries, agreed and contracts were signed. Well, shortly after, a huge ship arrived at the port of New Orleans. Women dressed in fine silks and satin emerged first, followed by men dressed in military clothing. Next came the brother of the Sultan, and finally the Sultan himself. Followed by them was an array of fine furniture, vases, and paintings being taken to the mansion. Now, over the next few months, the home was the hub of activity, with them throwing lavish parties with music and laughter emitting from the house. However, none of the New Orleans received an invite. In fact, the locals were never allowed in what was dubbed the Sultan's Palace.
And with that, we have to take a short break, and we'll be right back with more Ghost Talk Radio. You are listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting.